Ego death is one of the most mysterious and transformative psychological experiences a human being can undergo. It refers to the dissolution of one's sense of self, the collapse of the I, the identity that we so fiercely cling to as the center of our existence. To many, this sounds terrifying, almost like a form of annihilation. And in a way, it is, but it is also liberation. In the words of mystics, philosophers, and psychologists like Carl Jung and Eckhart Tolle, ego death is not the end of self-awareness, but the death of illusion, the illusion that you are only your thoughts, your roles, your possessions, and your past. The ego is the structure of the mind that constructs identity. It says, I am this, I want that, I deserve this. It creates boundaries between self and other, good and bad, success and failure. But when the ego becomes overdeveloped, we lose contact with our deeper self, the quiet observer behind the thoughts. Ego death dismantles this structure, often through crisis, meditation, trauma, or spiritual awakening. What's left is raw consciousness awareness without a label. This moment can feel terrifying because the ego resists its own dissolution. But when one passes through it, they emerge freer, lighter, and more deeply connected to reality. Ego death begins with the realization that the self you believe yourself to be, your name, your history, your opinions, your achievements, is not who you truly are. It is a psychological construct, a mental narrative created by thought and memory to give continuity to experience. The ego's function is to organize identity, to give you a sense of control and orientation in the world. Yet, the danger lies in mistaking this narrative for reality. The ego says, "This is me," and then spends its life defending that fragile illusion. When ego death occurs, this narrative collapses. It is not merely the loss of a belief, it is the disintegration of the entire structure that defines who you think you are. In the process of ego death, the boundaries that separate the self from the rest of existence begin to dissolve. You start to see that your identity is not fixed but fluid, that the person you believed yourself to be is only a temporary expression of something far greater. The roles you play, the worker, the friend, the parent, the lover, fall away, and what remains is pure awareness. For some, this is profoundly liberating. For others, it is terrifying. The ego clings to survival, and when it feels itself slipping, it resists with fear, confusion, or even panic. But what truly dies is not you, it is the illusion of control, the illusion that you are separate from life itself. From a psychological perspective, ego death can be understood as the collapse of the self-referential mind, the part of consciousness that interprets everything in terms of me and mine. Carl Jung saw this as a necessary phase in individuation, the process by which a person becomes whole. To know yourself fully, you must first let the false self die. In that death, the unconscious surfaces all the repressed fears, desires, and shadow aspects of the psyche. The ego can no longer filter or manipulate them. The experience can feel like being stripped naked before the vastness of existence, exposed yet profoundly real. Ego death is not destruction, it is revelation. When the illusion of separateness dissolves, a deeper form of self-awareness emerges, one not based on identity, but on presence. You become the observer of thoughts, not their prisoner. You realize that emotions, beliefs, and even personality are transient waves in a much larger ocean of consciousness. The I, that once seemed so solid, begins to feel transparent. And what fills that space is an expansive stillness, an awareness that has no boundaries. In this state, there is no longer a need to prove, compare, or possess. Life is no longer something happening to you. You are simply life itself, unfolding in infinite forms. What was once called ego death reveals itself as ego transcendence, the discovery that behind every mask, behind every story, there is a silent witness, untouched by time, unbroken by thought. The one who watches, that is who you truly are. Ego death often arises in moments of deep psychological or spiritual transformation, moments when the mind can no longer sustain its illusions of control. It may emerge during intense meditation, near-death experiences, existential crises, or under the influence of certain psychedelic substances that dissolve the ordinary boundaries of perception. In these moments, the ego, the narrator of experience, begins to disintegrate, and what remains is raw consciousness, unfiltered by the constructs of identity. To the person experiencing it, this can feel like the end of the world, yet paradoxically, it is often the beginning of truly seeing life as it is. In a psychological sense, ego death represents a collapse of the habitual structures through which we interpret reality. The mind, conditioned to categorize and define, suddenly loses its anchors. Without the lens of the ego, distinctions such as me and you, good and bad, or past and future, blur into one vast, seamless field of awareness. This is why many describe the experience as emerging with everything in encounter with unity or the divine. The individual no longer feels like a separate entity observing life. They are life itself, inseparable from the totality of existence. However, reaching this state is not achieved through mere intellectual understanding. The ego cannot think its way out of itself. It often requires an experience so intense that it overwhelms the normal mechanisms of self-definition. For some, this happens through meditation, where the constant observation of thought reveals that the thinker is itself an illusion. For others, it may arise in moments of profound loss or suffering, when all external sources of identity, career, relationships, status are stripped away, forcing confrontation with the raw essence of being. Psychedelic experiences, as studied in modern psychology and neuroscience, can also catalyze ego dissolution by temporarily disrupting the brain's default mode network, which is responsible for maintaining the sense of self. While these transformative states can be enlightening, they are not without risk. Ego death can trigger existential fear or psychological disorientation, especially when one is unprepared to face the emptiness that follows the collapse of identity. To the untrained mind, the loss of self can feel like annihilation, but to one who surrenders and accepts, it becomes liberation. What dies is the false, the rigid structure of identity built on memory, desire, and comparison, and what is born is an awareness that needs no definition. The process of ego death teaches that true transformation cannot occur without the surrender of control. It demands that one let go of every label, every narrative, and every belief about who they are. It is the death of the story so that the storyteller can finally see that there was never a separate I, at all only consciousness playing its eternal game of remembering and forgetting itself. Through this dissolution, a person emerges not diminished, but expanded, no longer confined by the walls of identity, but one with the infinite flow of being itself. The fear of ego death is one of the most powerful resistances a human mind can experience. It arises from the ego's primal instinct for survival, the deep, unconscious belief that I am what I think I am, and if those thoughts dissolve, then I, too, will cease to exist. This fear is not logical, it is existential. The ego does not differentiate between physical death and the death of identity because to it both feel like annihilation. So when a person approaches a state of ego dissolution, whether through meditation, trauma, or spiritual awakening, the ego fights desperately to preserve itself. It clings to familiar thoughts, memories, and narratives, creating a storm of anxiety, confusion, or panic. Psychologically, this resistance is rooted in our evolutionary need for control and coherence. The mind organizes reality through structure and identity. I am this, not that. These distinctions give us a sense of security and orientation in a chaotic world. The ego's job is to maintain those boundaries, to ensure continuity of the self from one moment to the next. Ego death threatens that continuity. It dissolves the boundary between self and world, between subject and object. This dissolution feels like a loss of ground beneath the feet, the disappearance of the reference point from which we navigate reality. The fear, therefore, is not of dying in a literal sense, but of losing the I. that defines meaning and purpose. In spiritual traditions, this fear is seen as the last defense of illusion. Mystics from Buddhism to Sufism have long taught that the ego resists surrender because it equates surrender with destruction. Yet paradoxically, only in surrender does true freedom emerge, when one stops fighting to preserve the I. A deeper awareness begins to shine through an awareness that is not dependent on thought or form, but the transition can feel like darkness before dawn. The ego may project terrifying images, existential dread, or an overwhelming sense of emptiness. It will whisper you are disappearing, when in truth you are awakening. From a therapeutic perspective, this fear of ego death is similar to the fear of change or transformation. People cling to suffering, habits, and false beliefs because these, however painful, offer familiarity. Letting go means stepping into the unknown, and the unknown feels like death to the ego. Yet once the surrender happens, individuals often describe a profound peace, a sense that what they thought was dying was merely a mask falling away. The observer behind all experience, the true self, remains untouched. In overcoming this fear, one must understand that ego death is not a destruction of the self, but a return to wholeness. The I that dissolves was never permanent. It was a story, a lens, a temporary arrangement of thought. What remains is pure awareness, timeless, unbound, and infinitely still. To face ego death without fear is to trust in the deeper intelligence of life itself. It is to see that behind the illusion of separation, there is nothing to lose because what you truly are has never been born and can never die. Ego death, though often perceived as a terrifying loss, can lead to profound clarity and peace once it is fully experienced and integrated. When the ego, that constant voice of comparison, judgment, and desire, dissolves, what remains is a stillness beyond understanding. The endless chatter of the mind, the internal monologue that measures every moment against memory and expectation, falls silent. For perhaps the first time, the individual experiences life as it is unfiltered, unlabeled, and complete in itself. This state is not one of emotional numbness but of pure awareness. It is a deep calm that arises when the need to define, control, or justify one's existence disappears. Psychologically, this clarity comes from the collapse of identification. For most of life, we identify with thoughts and emotions, believing that they define who we are. We say, I am sad, I am angry, I am successful, or I am a failure. But during ego death, the observer realizes that emotions and thoughts are temporary phenomena like clouds passing through the vast sky of consciousness. When one stops identifying with them, suffering begins to dissolve. The peace that follows is not the absence of thought, but the absence of attachment to thought. The person no longer feels enslaved by the mind's stories. They can see them for what they are: fleeting waves on the surface of a deeper, still ocean. In this state, happiness no longer depends on external conditions. The usual pursuits, wealth, approval, recognition, lose their grip because the individual understands that no external experience can complete what is already whole within. This realization brings a kind of inner freedom that cannot be taken away. The person becomes less reactive, less defensive, and more compassionate because the boundaries of self and other begin to blur. They see that every person's struggle is part of the same human experience, that the pain they once personalized is universal. Philosophers and mystics often describe this as awakening, not in a mystical sense, but in a profoundly psychological one. When the ego dies, perception becomes direct. The mind no longer filters reality through the lens of what it means for me. Instead, things simply are. A flower, a breeze, a moment of silence, these are experienced without interpretation or purpose. And in this simplicity lies extraordinary beauty. The individual no longer seeks meaning because life itself becomes the meaning. From a therapeutic standpoint, this stage of ego death can resemble the resolution of inner conflict. The fragmented parts of the psyche, the inner critic, the fearful child, the ambitious self no longer battle for dominance. They are seen as expressions of the same consciousness. The inner noise quiets, and what replaces it is a grounded sense of being. The peace that follows ego death is not fragile. It is not dependent on remaining calm or spiritual. It is a deep knowing that everything is already as it should be. In this clarity, the individual no longer strives to escape suffering or chase joy. Both are seen as movements within the same infinite whole. And in that realization, the war within finally ends. After experiencing ego death, many individuals describe a profound sense of humility, a recognition that the universe is infinitely larger, wiser, and more mysterious than their personal desires and fears. When the ego dissolves, the illusion of personal control fades away. Life is no longer seen as something to be dominated or conquered, but something to be harmonized with. The person begins to flow with existence instead of resisting it. This humility is not weakness, it is strength born from surrender. It allows a person to accept both joy and suffering as parts of the same continuum. In this state, there is no longer an obsessive need to prove oneself, to be seen as successful, or to chase validation. Instead, one finds beauty in simplicity, in small acts, quiet moments, and genuine connections that were once overlooked by a restless, ego-driven mind. Psychologically, this humility can be described as the collapse of narcissistic illusion, the false belief that one's self-concept is the center of all meaning. Before ego death, the mind often lives in a state of constant self-referential thinking. What do they think of me? Am I enough? Am I better or worse than others? But after the ego's boundaries dissolve, the person sees the futility of these questions. They realize that they were never truly separate from others in the first place. This realization births a deep compassion, not as a moral duty, but as an instinctive understanding that all beings share the same essence, the same struggle, and the same longing to feel whole. In this humility, control is replaced by trust. The person no longer feels compelled to manipulate outcomes or resist uncertainty. They recognize that life's unfolding is not entirely within their command, and that this is not a tragedy but a liberation. The acceptance of not knowing becomes a profound peace. Every experience, pleasant or painful, is seen as a teacher, not an obstacle. This attitude reflects a mature form of psychological surrender, where the individual allows life to guide them instead of fighting against what is. Philosophically, this can be compared to the wisdom found in many spiritual traditions that speak of dying before you die. It means letting go of the illusion of personal supremacy while still alive, recognizing that the self is but a transient expression of something infinite. This perspective creates a radical shift in how one interacts with the world. Relationships become less about possession and more about presence. Work becomes less about status and more about purpose. Even suffering becomes less about why me and more about what is this showing me. The humility following ego death also reshapes one's relationship with knowledge and truth. The person no longer seeks to be right, they seek to understand. They recognize that every perspective, even those they disagree with, contains fragments of the whole truth. This openness to contradiction reflects psychological growth, the ability to hold multiple realities without needing to collapse them into a single narrative. Ultimately, humility after ego death is not about thinking less of oneself, but about seeing oneself as part of an intricate, living whole. It's the realization that the drop is not separate from the ocean, it is the ocean. And in that recognition, the endless striving to become someone fades away, replaced by a quiet reverence for simply being. After ego death, a profound transformation occurs in how one relates to emotions and inner experiences. Before this event, emotions are often filtered through the ego's desires. Joy is sought, pain is resisted, pride is nourished, and shame is hidden. The ego clings to emotional highs and avoids lows, creating an endless cycle of attachment and aversion. But once the ego dissolves, emotions lose their manipulative power. They are no longer seen as enemies or trophies, but as natural expressions of the human condition, waves that rise and fall within the ocean of consciousness. The individual learns to feel without being consumed, to observe without reacting, and to allow without resistance. This shift brings an extraordinary form of emotional freedom. When the ego is alive, emotions serve the self-image, anger defends pride, sadness fuels victimhood, and happiness becomes proof of worth. But when ego death occurs, emotions are no longer bound to identity. Anger becomes energy, sadness becomes depth, and joy becomes gratitude. The person experiences emotions as movements of life, not personal crises. This is what psychologists describe as emotional integration, the ability to experience emotions fully without identifying with them. The mind no longer says, "I am sad," or "I am angry." Instead, it says, "Sadness is passing through me." That linguistic shift marks a massive psychological evolution. With this emotional clarity, the need to escape or numb discomfort weakens. People who have experienced ego death often describe a newfound capacity to sit with pain, not as punishment, but as presence. The avoidance mechanisms that once dominated their lives, overthinking, addiction, constant distraction, begin to dissolve because they were all rooted in the ego's fear of feeling powerless. When that fear collapses, the person stops running. They learn to breathe in suffering, to give it space, and to let it transform naturally. Pain, instead of being rejected, becomes a portal to wisdom. Philosophically, this mirrors the idea that emotions are not problems to be fixed, but signals to be understood. After ego death, the emotional landscape becomes less chaotic because the person no longer believes every feeling requires reaction or justification. They realize that emotions are temporary phenomena, whether passing through consciousness. This understanding breeds serenity. Even during intense grief or anger, a quiet awareness remains untouched, like the sky above a storm. That awareness becomes the person's true center, replacing the fragile identity of the ego. This new emotional equilibrium also transforms relationships. Because the ego is no longer dictating emotional responses, there's less need to defend, control, or manipulate others. Empathy deepens naturally. One begins to listen without waiting to respond, to love without fearing loss, and to forgive without needing closure. Emotional maturity becomes effortless because it is no longer filtered through insecurity or pride. Ultimately, the psychology of post-ego emotional life is one of balance and depth. The person feels more deeply, not less, but those feelings no longer dominate the mind. They rise, they teach, and they pass. In this state, the emotional self becomes a transparent window rather than a distorting mirror. It reflects life as it is, unfiltered, raw, and profoundly beautiful in its impermanence. After ego death, one of the most remarkable realizations a person experiences is the profound sense of unity with all existence. The boundary between me and the world begins to dissolve. The illusion of separateness, the belief that we are isolated entities striving against an indifferent universe, fades away. What emerges instead is a direct awareness that everything is interconnected, that every breath, every sound, every form of life participates in a shared rhythm of being. The individual who once lived behind walls of judgment, fear, and comparison now experiences life as a single living continuum. The self that once said "I" now feels like a wave recognizing itself as the ocean. This sense of unity is not an intellectual concept. It is an emotional and existential revelation. Before ego death, the mind lives in duality, self and other, good and bad, success and failure. It divides everything into opposites to sustain its identity. But after the dissolution of ego, those opposites lose their grip. There is no longer an internal war between what is and what should be. The person begins to accept existence as it unfolds, without trying to dominate or categorize it. This acceptance is not passive but liberating. It brings peace because the struggle to control reality finally ends. In this state, compassion arises effortlessly. When the ego falls away, the suffering of others no longer feels foreign. The pain in another person's eyes is felt as one's own because the barrier that separated their pain from my peace no longer exists. The psychology of compassion shifts from sympathy to identification, not in a self-destructive way, but in a deeply human one. Helping others no longer comes from a sense of moral duty or self-righteousness, but from an authentic recognition that healing others is, in some sense, healing oneself. Philosophically, this unity resembles what mystics and psychologists alike have described as the unitive state. A level of consciousness where individuality is preserved but the sense of isolation disappears. The person still functions in society, still uses language and identity, but internally they live from a deeper awareness, one that sees through the masks of ego, competition, and division. They can move through the world with calmness because they understand that every act, every moment, and every encounter is part of a greater harmony. This realization also changes how they experience time and mortality. Without the ego's fear-driven narrative, death no longer appears as annihilation but as transformation. The person recognizes that just as a wave returns to the sea, so too will the self return to the infinite consciousness from which it emerged. This understanding doesn't make one indifferent to life, but more appreciative of it. Every moment becomes sacred, every experience meaningful, precisely because it is fleeting and interconnected with all others. Ultimately, this unity after ego death represents the completion of inner evolution. The individual no longer lives as a fragment seeking wholeness, but as wholeness expressing itself through a fragment. They live not for validation, not for status, not even for happiness, but for presence. Their life becomes a quiet, luminous dance with existence itself, free from fear, comparison, and the endless noise of I. In that stillness, they finally understand what it means to truly be